Good evening, Booktube. This is Johnny, and I thought I'd make I make a video tonight since I'm in the mood. Maybe being on this cold medicine is kind of making me kind of hyper because I just want to make videos all the time. And I think I've mentioned that when I come to the end of a year, the final days, the shirt's awful hot. I don't know why I'm overheating. When we come to the end of a year, we're in December. Today is December the 19th. It is a Tuesday here in West Michigan. It is 7:24 at night. When we come to the end of a year, I find myself looking over my life, and I thought that I would just share those thoughts since I look at my YouTube as the diary of a bookworm, a Christian bookworm. That's what I think makes me different from other booktubers. Not saying that there are booktubers who are Christians or they're Jewish or they're Buddhists or they're into witchcraft or they're into paganism. And that's what their perspective when they talk about books is from a pagan perspective or a gay perspective or a feminist perspective or an atheist perspective. I try to interpret reality from a Christian biblical perspective, and when I read, I'm always discerning what I'm reading. I'm just not swallowing it without filtering it through a biblical world and life view, a Christian evangelical kind of view. But last night I was talking about, I got that thing in the mail from the seminary that we went to, and I use my timeline here because I can't keep track of time. And it says here that we moved to Jackson, Mississippi to attend Reformed Theological Seminary in 1983, and we graduated in 1986, and we moved to Houston, Texas. I was 34 years old in 1986. And we left Houston, Texas in 1991, and we moved here to Holland. When I was talking about my internship there in Houston, Texas, we were there for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6 years, 5 years at least. I don't want to give the impression that it was a totally bad experience. Now, yeah, there was some aspects of it that was kind of really devastating and very difficult because I'm by nature a very insecure person, maybe oversensitive, very serious, and I invested a lot in going into the ministry. I had left California. I had gone to Bible college. I had went through all the ordeal of all those experiences, which is very difficult for me because by nature I'm not a get out and go kind of person. I had to really force myself to do all those things. But, and it wasn't easy getting through seminary. It wasn't easy getting through Bible college. It wasn't easy, well, to be honest, life isn't easy. When you get my age, you realize that life is pretty difficult. It's hard. Life is hard. But anyway, I didn't want to give a totally negative. There were good things about those 5 years or 6 years in Houston, Texas. Even though we were pretty much left on our own, in some ways, maybe that's why I liked it. I didn't want people always scrutinizing us. And we were involved in some of the people's lives at the church. I mean, we did go to their houses for meals, and we did go to potlucks, and we went to weddings and Presbyterian meetings, and I taught Sunday school. I preached those 2 years of my internship. The last 3 years I didn't do anything in the church after my internship. I wasn't licensed again, which is another long story why I didn't renew my licensure. That's a very long story. But I just want to mention some of the things that came to my mind about those 5 years, and it goes around books. Because when I was in Houston, I was left to my own devices, and I got involved in things that interest me. And some things I got involved in are shown by books. One thing I've mentioned in previous videos is that when we were living in Houston, I couldn't find any good evangelical, Presbyterian kind of bookstores. So I wound up I got involved in going to a Catholic bookstore, St. Mary's Catholic bookstore in downtown Houston. It took me almost a half hour to drive to this little tiny bookstore. And I would go there because when I was in Houston, I got into Christian spirituality and Christian mysticism. Because as I mentioned in other videos, when I was in seminary, I did a seminar on Christian spirituality that reawakened my interest in the contemplative life, the spiritual life that is set forth in the writings of St. John of the Cross. And I continued that interest when I got into Houston. Not only was there did I go to this Catholic bookstore, but near where we lived in Houston was a Catholic seminary that I think it was also St. Mary's Seminary, and I would go to that seminary to check out books. They let me check out books. You know, I told them I was an intern and I was a Christian, and they gave me a library card, and I would go there when possible, and I'd check out books, and I would read about mysticism and the contemplative life and prayer. Because one of the classes I taught in my internship was on the history and practice of prayer. And so I really got into the prayer, all the aspects of prayer: supplication, intercession, confession, praise, silence, all kinds of, so I really got into it. But I also got into other things, and one of the things I got into was the beatniks. And to give you an example, when we were living in Houston, I bought the Jack Kerouac Collection. Now this is not CDs; these are cassettes. Back when we lived in Houston, back in the 80s, like I said, we lived in Houston from 1986 to 1991, and I was really into cassettes. I think I've mentioned, I used to use boom boxes all the time. I used to buy cassette tapes, listen to sermon tapes on these big boom boxes. I used to have a series of them over the years. Now I have a big stereo system that I bought back in the 90s, and I'm on my second stereo system. But back then I was in cassettes. That's what I played on my boombox. And I had heard that they were going to put out the Jack Kerouac Collection. And so I called all over Houston, Texas. Now Houston, the city of Houston, there in Texas, trying to find this box set. And I found this record store, some way downtown Houston. And I remember driving there. It almost took me at least almost an hour to get there. And I bought this Jack Kerouac Collection. And of course, you know, it has a thing in there, Jack Kerouac, and it has little things in here. And, you know, it has these little cassettes. See, it has cassettes. Jack Kerouac, The Beat Generation, and it has Jack Kerouac, The Last Word. These are all him singing, reciting poetry, you know, those kinds of things. And so I got into the beats once again. I would look all over Houston. I'd go to all kinds of bookstores looking for books on the beats. And back then, it was very difficult to find books on the beats. Now, there's been a resurgence in the last 20-some odd years. But back then, it was really hard to find anything. I remember buying this book at some bookstore in Houston called Paradise Outlaws, Remembering the Beats by John Tytell. And so, yeah, I bought that. I remember buying this book in Houston. And I got into reading what I could find by the beatniks. I mean, Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Ginsberg. I had some books, but I have bought more in the last 26 years that we've been here in Holland, Michigan. Like I said, I got into Mysticism, and this is a book I bought in Houston. This is a classic introduction to Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill. Once again, I heard about this book by reading, and I wanted to find a copy for it. And I looked all over Houston, and finally at some kind of New Age store that sold crystal and all this New Age stuff, you know, I found a copy. So I bought this in Houston. So yeah, if you want an introduction to Christian mysticism, read Evelyn Underhill. This is a prime source. Also, I mentioned, like I said, I bought Carthusian Spirituality when we lived in Houston. This book is one of my favorite all-time books. I read it every year, and I should read it again starting in January. But I really got into the Carthusians. I started collecting the classics of Western spirituality, which I have down the lower level. I have at least 30 of them. But this is one of my favorites. Also, there was a bookstore called Half Price Books and Records right near where the church I did my internship at. And I would go there, and I bought these records. Back when we lived in Houston, I had a record player. I don't now. I should buy a turntable, but now I buy CDs. I have thousands of CDs. But I bought these Patti Smith group records at Half Price Books and Records there in Houston, Texas. This is her Easter, Radio, Ethopia, and then Horses. So I bought these when we lived in Houston. So the point is that when I was in Houston and I was left on my own, I got back into the beatniks. I got back into the writings of Kerouac, Ginsberg. I really got into music. I used to listen to one of these public radio stations that played all kinds of music, folk music, Irish music, punk music, rock music, world music, and I used to listen to it all the time. When we lived in Houston, I volunteered at fundraising times, go down there, and I would answer the phone, and I really got involved. So I got back into music after, and so I bought a lot of cassettes, which are in my main study now. I have them stored in my closet in my main study. I still got a cold and a sore throat. So yeah, so when we were in Houston, I saw Bob Dylan in concert. I saw the Grateful Dead. I saw our kids grow up, Bethany and Josiah and Caleb. They were little when we moved, and they were in elementary school, and we had a good life. We got a dog. I mentioned we had Macintosh. We bought a West Highland Terrier. And, you know, we had a dog, and we had friends from church, and I was able to read a lot and to explore a lot of things, Christian mysticism, Christian spirituality. I got into punk music. I got into Sonic Youth, the Pixies. Just goes on and on. Peter Murphy, the House of Love, all kinds of. I got into a lot of Van Morrison, a lot of Bob Dylan, Bruce Cockburn, and so I was into music. I was into Christian mysticism. I was into the Beatniks. I was listening to Patti Smith, listening to Jack Kerouac poetry. And one thing else is I haven't mentioned, when we lived in Houston, we lived in two different places. The first place, when we first got into Houston, we lived in this house, and then the person who was renting us the house, they sold the house, and so we had to move. And we moved into a house. It was a really nice house. It had a big backyard, all fenced in for our dog Macintosh. But just 2 blocks from where we lived was a public library, and I could just walk there right to that library any day. It wasn't a big library. It was just a small library, but I would check out John Irving, and you know, I check out books. And they also sold used books, a little rack, little thing, and I found this book. And this is called Varieties of Psychedelic Experience, the first comprehensive guide to the effects of LSD on human personality, by Masters in Houston. Now, this book I bought at this library used, but I had this book. When I saw this, I was really kind of glad or kind of excited, because I had a copy of this in my early 20s. Many years ago, when I mentioned I went after high school, I mentioned, see, it says here, in 1971, I was 19 years old, and I attended Contra Costa Junior College after high school in San Pablo, California. In 1972, I attended Mackinac Island Liberal Arts College on Mackinac Island here in Michigan. That's a long story, and I was 20 years old. And they had a bookstore. This liberal arts Christian college had a bookstore, and I bought a copy of this book. I don't know why they were selling it, because you know, it was a Christian bookstore and they were selling books about LSD. So I bought it, but I had lost it over the years. And so when we were in Houston, I found this used copy. And so when I see this, it reminds me of another thing about Houston, is the whole psychedelics experience. Because when I was in high school, in my early 20s, I was into psychedelics. I took LSD, peyote, mescaline, any kind of mind-expanding drugs I took. And I took them not with people. I would go off into the woods, where I would go to the ocean, where I would sit in some shack in the woods, and I would write, and I would drop acid, and I would just think. I would just trip, go off into my own world. And I always had books. I always had my diary, and I would write it all down. All those experiences I wrote down. You know, I would always carry a backpack with paper and pens and books, and I would write whatever was going through my head. But like I said, when I left California to attend, I left California in 1978 to go to Reformed Bible College. And before I left California in 1978, I burned all my writings. And I said that's the most stupidest thing I ever did. I burned all my diaries from high school up until 1978, from 68 to 78. Well, I have parts of 78. I destroyed 1968 to 1977. All of the things I had collected underground newspapers, photographs, letters. I used to draw. I used to doodle, and I had felt pens and notebooks, and I was a conscious objector against the Vietnam War, and I had all my conscious objector folders, and I was in the anti-war movement. I marched, and I went to rock concerts and had rock posters, and I had tons of stuff. It took me 2 days to burn all that stuff in my girlfriend's fireplace. And it was the most stupidest thing I've ever done. But I had this romantic notion. I was leaving California, leaving that life and burning my bridges and starting all over. And in a way I did. When I came to Grand Rapids, I got a job at Mel Trotter's rescue mission. I met Carol. You know the story. We got married. And soon after I moved to Grand Rapids, I started writing again. But I was increased more and more over the years. That I write more and more and more and more and more. I've always been writing. I've always carried around this, like I said, I've had this since high school. And I've always been writing. I've always been reading, always thinking and wandering. And like I told my wife this evening, some people, I'm a dreamer. I've always been a dreamer. I'm always off in my head. Like I said, I don't have any friends here in Holland, Michigan. I don't have any. My friend I did have, kind of lost contact with. And so I talk to Booktube, and I keep online diaries, and I have Flickr, and I have Facebook, and I volunteer at the library used bookstore, and I try to reach out and not just become totally withdrawn into my own dreams, in my own world of books and literature and art and music. And I have, I have a very intimate relationship with my wife. I love my kids, my grandkids, but I'm kind of, I'm self-contained. And I think a lot of that's because of how I was raised. I had a very traumatic childhood, and it was very difficult. And one thing else about December, see, it says here, 1968, December the 21st, mother killed in a car wreck. I never knew my father. I told you about the DNA. I was supposed to get the results anytime in the mail. I told that story about the DNA. You can see that video if you look through the last couple of videos. But in 1968, my mother was killed in a car wreck. She was coming home from work. She was working in a bar, and she didn't hear an ambulance, and the ambulance rammed into her and killed her instantaneously. And I was 16 years old at that time. So when December comes around, December 1968, December the 21st is when I remember my mother's death. I was never, and so I don't really have much memories of my mother. I have no memories of my father. I never knew him, never met him. I had stepfathers. My mother was married twice for very short periods of time, maybe 2-3 years. And when she was killed, she was 35 or 36 years old. And I was 16. And I've been basically on my own since I was 16 years old. Wow. So, yeah, so